Welcome to another drug-induced rambling video where medical stuff is delaying other projects, so I'm on painkillers talking about whatever. One of my ongoing projects I've wanted to do is expand on the relationship between organizations like anonymous intelligence agencies and groups such as the Islamic State. Today I'd like to talk a little bit about biowarfare and slavery. Part of the public misunderstanding of how various counterterrorism plans work is caused not just by people lacking relevant skills, but the use of inaccurate information to project and inform other assessments. And it becomes a cycle of misinformation and public perception can grow further and further away from reality more than anyone realizes at first. An important thing to remember is not to fixate exclusively on morality. When I hear, for example, the claim that the Islamic State is immoral because they use slavery and have sex slaves, or you can purchase a sex slave at a market, it's important to remember someone that's been thoroughly inducted and educated by a family that has relocated to the Islamic State, for example. They will have the associated world views, and they're not going to think they're doing anything wrong. They may have been taught that you are telling them slavery is wrong for malevolent reasons. You wish to destabilize the economy in Raqqa. After all, for a backward people, slavery was a virtuous gift bestowed on them, and you wish to rob them of that because the devil has seduced you away from guiding a backward people to a virtuous life. What a terrible thing for you to do. Morality arguments are very subjective because anyone engaged in a morality argument is ultimately arguing based on their moral position versus another moral position, and, not always but very often, they've ascribed a predetermined right or wrong. And if the other participant's predetermined right or wrong doesn't match up, it's going to be difficult for the conversation to really progress anywhere. And this has a habit of unnecessarily muddying the waters. If a fixation is placed on morality, completely legitimate economic or safety or health arguments that would be perhaps better at persuading the opponent can end up being completely overlooked, and as such a morality argument can end up clouding things unnecessarily. A related issue to public detachment is how people project themselves into unrealistic expectations. All too often I hear someone say something like, well, if I were the president, or if I were in control of the CIA, or if I had control of the American government, I'd be able to do X, Y, or Z really easily. Well, no shit, Sherlock. If anyone had complete autocratic control over enormous resources, of course they'd be able to accomplish a lot with relative ease. It's not so easy to convince everyone to be united behind one goal, because there are as many different views on how to best plan for humanity's future as there are people. And while there are benefits to quick-acting authority, there's also downsides. Let's project ourselves into a much less enviable position. How about instead of being in charge of an organization like the CIA, you're a mid-level bureaucrat in Sweden? You have no legal authority to prevent someone from defecting to the Islamic State, except politely phone-calling them to ask them to reconsider. You have a small amount of funds and resources to work with if you want to dip your feet into counterterrorism, but can't do so publicly because you risk removal from office. You love your country, you want what's best for your country, but so too does everyone around you, and you think your way is better, just like everyone else. That delightful position is perhaps less appetizing. So now, what are your recourses to try to deal with the defectors to the Islamic State with your non-functional legal authority and your meager resources? Perhaps you have some connections for your political power, but not enough to change public policy in Sweden. Well, one option that might creep into the back of your mind is cheaper and more covert and also cost-effective methods to discourage people from wanting to go to the Islamic State. Something you might reasonably be able to scrape together the resources to influence. Suppose, for example, you became aware not of the moral wrongdoing of sex slavery, but of something more mundane. Let's say public health risks. What are the public health risks that come associated with lots of foreigners congregating in the Islamic State in an arid environment, bringing all their germs from all over the globe to one location with low-quality healthcare and an increasing population? Now, with the answer to that in mind, let me ask you another question. Now that we've established a lot of people from a lot of areas are congregating somewhere with limited access to good public health care, let's say that in that area they allow sex slaves to be purchased and sold, and use of contraceptives and STI protection might be of limited availability or become progressively more scarce or less likely to be used for whatever reason. Now, think about how these points interact with one another. You can't legally stop your citizens from defecting, but perhaps a lot less people would be motivated to go if they could be made to believe that they'd, for example, be going to an area likely to have an AIDS epidemic outbreak, or experience other forms of disease control lapses, which might be expected to worsen in the coming months. Or perhaps even you could convince an entity like the Islamic State not to want as many foreigners coming and bringing their germs and sicknesses. Perhaps instead of being able to change public policy or pass a law trying to keep Swedish citizens from leaving, perhaps it would be much more easy, much more cheap, and much more likely for you to get away with a small injection with a disease during blood work during a physical, for example, to make sure the Swedish citizens that are leaving the country and defecting make it a lot less appealing, or nudge things in the direction of the Islamic State not wanting more foreigners to come. After all, if their recruitment has involved social media and it hasn't been taken down by a group like Anonymous, they might even talk about their plans to defect to ISIS if their government won't prevent them. It might even make it a little easier to conclude you're doing the right thing, since you have more opportunity to verify that you're picking the right targets to have an accident with something nasty in one of their needles during a vaccine before they go traveling abroad. You might not have a lot of power or authority as a mid-level bureaucrat in Sweden. You probably won't be able to change the laws, much less actually enforce a prohibition if you did. But maybe you could have the power to nudge things away from people wanting to defect, if the health risks of going off to join the Islamic State became more pronounced, and became a more active deterrent, or if the Islamic State became suspicious of foreigners coming with diseases. It requires so much less money, power, influence, and be so much easier to get away with. Hell, if Anonymous didn't knock out the socials, and this is a country where someone can announce their plans to join, and is more likely to do so without fear of being arrested, how tempting do you think that option would be? After all, many of these health risks, such as, for example, the massive public health risks associated with buying and selling sex slaves, are going to be present regardless of your actions. Wouldn't it be so much easier to rationalize, knowing you're not really changing anything, just accelerating a process? Instead of ascribing morality or saying who's right or wrong, think about how tempting that would be. And I'd like to reiterate my earlier point. It's very easy for someone to rationalize a morality. Simply saying that's wrong might not help very much, but there may instead be a more quantifiable reason that could be used instead. Thank you for listening. I'd like to take a moment to promote The Masked Arab. If you're unfamiliar with him, he's making a series of videos on the morality and headspace associated with the Islamic State and the justifications they'll use for their actions. He's made about 4 videos on the subject at the moment, and I found the ones I've watched very interesting. His most recent episode talks about suicide attacks, trends for and against support of suicide attacks among Muslims, as well as the lack of consensus on the topic. I'll provide a link in the description box below this video. Please consider dropping by and telling him Pooky says snuggles. Snuggle you next time!